The story of Sufism begins in the first centuries after the Prophet Muhammad. The early Muslims lived in a world that was still forming its ideas about God, law, and community. In the desert towns of Iraq and the Arabian Peninsula, people gathered to pray, to share meals, and to talk about the meaning of the Quran. From these simple gatherings grew a new way of looking at faith. It was a way that treated prayer as a personal conversation, as if a child were learning to share toys with a friend, or as if a gardener watched a seed turn into a sprout. Hassan al-Basri is one of the first names that appears in the history of this movement. He was born in Basra around the year 642. He grew up in a city that was a busy port and a place where many different ideas met. Hassan spent his youth in the market, listening to merchants and scholars. When he was a teenager, he heard the call to prayer and felt a pull toward a deeper love of God. He left his family's business and spent long hours in the mosque. He would stay after the formal prayers, sitting alone in the cool night, whispering verses of the Quran. He said that the world feels like a prison for a believer and a garden for a disbeliever. The famous saying, "The world is a prison for the believer and a paradise for the disbeliever," is recorded in early collections of his sayings. Hassan taught that true worship is not just the outward acts that the community sees, but the inner feeling that makes a person feel close to God at any moment. Rabia al-Adawiyya is another key figure. She was born in Basra around 717. Her life story is told in many early biographies. When she was a child, a fire broke out in her home. She was saved, but the experience left a deep mark. She began to speak about love for God that was not tied to fear of punishment. In one well-known saying she said, "I love God for God's sake." This short line captures a core idea of early Sufism. Love that does not ask for reward, but simply exists because God is present. Rabia lived a simple life. She gave away the few possessions she owned, and she spent many hours in the desert, sitting under a palm tree, looking at the sky. People who visited her would hear her talk about the heart as a garden where love can grow if it is watered with prayer. The early Sufi thinkers were not isolated scholars. They were travelers, merchants, and people who moved across the desert. They carried with them stories of the Prophet's night of revelation. The night when the angel Gabriel first spoke to Muhammad is called Laylat al-Qadr. In the early years, people would sit around a fire and retell the scene. A traveler from Kufa would say, "When the night fell, the sky was like a thick veil, and the angel's voice was like a gentle breeze." The story reminded listeners that the divine can come in quiet moments, not only in loud proclamations. This memory helped shape the early Sufi view that God can be felt in a whisper, in the breath of a desert wind. Another anecdote comes from the rise of mystic circles in Basra. In the mid-7th century, a small group of young men began meeting after the formal prayers. They would sit on the floor, share dates, and discuss verses of the Quran. One night, a man named Abu al-Mufith arrived, carrying a simple wooden bowl. He poured water into the bowl and said, "This water is like the heart. When it is clean, it reflects God's light." The group listened and felt a new sense of closeness. The gatherings grew, and soon the city of Basra was known for its circles of love. These circles were not formal schools, but places where people could speak openly about their inner feelings. The story of Abu al-Mufith's bowl is recorded in early Sufi literature and shows how simple objects were used to teach deep ideas. The desert travelers turned prayer into a personal conversation by using everyday experiences. Imagine a child learning to share toys. At first, the child may keep a favorite toy to himself. Over time, the child sees that sharing brings smiles and friendship. The child learns that giving is a way to feel close to others. In the same way, early Sufis learned that prayer is not just a duty, but a chance to give love to God. They saw prayer as a way to open the heart, just as a child opens a hand to share. A gardener watching seeds sprout gives another picture. A seed is small and hidden in the soil. The gardener waters it, waits, and watches a tiny green shoot appear. The gardener knows that the seed cannot grow without care, but also knows that the seed has its own life. Early Sufis thought of the soul as a seed. The soul needs the water of prayer, the light of knowledge, and the soil of community to grow. When the soul is cared for, it sprouts into a life that feels close to God. These simple pictures helped spread the ideas beyond scholars. A merchant traveling from Basra to Kufa could tell a story about a child sharing toys, and a farmer in the fields could relate to the seed analogy. The ideas spread like a gentle wind across the early Islamic world. Later sections of the video will look at how these early ideas turned into daily practice and into poetry. The practice of dhikr, or remembrance of God, grew out of the early circles. Poets such as Rumi and Hafez would later write verses that echo the same images of gardens, children, and simple love. Some people ask whether Sufism is a separate religion or just a spiritual style within Islam. One argument says that Sufism has its own rituals, its own saints, and its own places of worship, so it must be a different religion. The counter to this point is simple. The core beliefs of Sufism, belief in the oneness of God, the prophethood of Muhammad, and the Quran, are the same as those of mainstream Islam. The extra practices are like ways to deepen the same belief, not new beliefs. For example, a Christian may pray the rosary or chant hymns. These are styles, not separate religions. In the same way, Sufis use dhikr and poetry to feel closer to God, but they do not deny the 5 pillars of Islam. A second argument says that because Sufis sometimes speak of union with God, they must be creating a new faith. The response to this is also clear. The word union is a metaphor. When a mystic says that the heart is united with God, he means that the heart no longer feels separation. He does not mean that God becomes a person, or that the laws of Islam change. The metaphor is like saying that a river merges with the sea. The water does not become the sea, but it flows into it. The same logic applies to the mystic language. The language is poetic, not doctrinal. It helps the listener feel the closeness that the mystic experiences. These two counter-arguments show that Sufism is best understood as a spiritual style that lives inside Islam, not a separate faith. The early circles in Basra, the teachings of Hassan al-Basri, and the love of Rabi all point to a deepening of the same faith that the Prophet taught. The night of the Prophet's revelation also gave early Sufis a model for personal experience. The Quran says that the night is better than 1,000 months. The early mystics took this to mean that a single night of sincere prayer can be more powerful than many years of empty ritual. They taught that the heart can be opened in a moment, just as a child can learn to share a toy in a single play session. The rise of the early mystic circles in Basra showed how a small group can grow into a lasting tradition. The story of Abu al-Mufti's bowl is remembered because it shows how a simple act can spark a movement. The bowl was not a holy relic, but a tool to explain a deeper truth. The group that gathered around it grew into a network that spread to other cities, such as Kufa, Damascus, and later to Persia. In the early days, Sufi ideas also mixed with the daily life of the desert. A camel driver would stop at a well, pour water, and say a short prayer for the travelers. He would feel the water as a symbol of God's mercy. A weaver would chant a verse while turning the loom, feeling each thread as a link to the divine. These everyday acts became the building blocks of a new way of seeing the world. The early Sufis also used stories from the Quran to illustrate their points. The story of the night journey, when the Prophet traveled from Mecca to Jerusalem and then to the heavens, was told in many gatherings. The story showed that the soul can travel beyond the physical world. The mystics used this story to say that prayer can lift the heart, just as the Prophet's soul was lifted. The early Sufi teachers also emphasized humility. Hassan al-Basri once said, "When you see a man with a crown, remember that the crown is on his head, not in his heart." This short line teaches that outward status does not mean inner purity. Rabi'ah's life showed this too. She lived in a small house, gave away her few belongings, and still felt the deepest love for God. Her example is a living proof that wealth does not equal closeness to the divine. The early Sufi movement was not without critics. Some scholars worried that the focus on inner feeling could lead to neglect of the law. They argued that the Quran and the Prophet's teachings are clear, and that any extra practice could be a distraction. The Sufi response was simple. They said that the law is the outer shape of a house, while love is the interior. Both are needed for a complete home. The house without walls cannot stand, and the house without a hearth is cold. This analogy helped many understand that the outer and inner parts of faith support each other. The early mystics also used music and rhythm in their gatherings. They would clap their hands, tap drums, and chant verses in a gentle rhythm. This practice later became known as sama, a form of listening to spiritual music. The early use of rhythm was not for entertainment, but to help the heart focus. A simple drum beat can be like the steady pulse of a heart, reminding the listener of the divine beat within. The stories of the early Sufis spread across the Islamic world. Travelers carried the tales to Baghdad, to Cairo, to Cordoba. In each place, the stories were adapted to local culture. In Persia, the garden image became a central theme. In Andalusia, the image of the night sky was used to talk about the infinite nature of God. These adaptations show how the early ideas were flexible, yet stayed true to the core belief in love and closeness to God. Later, poets would write verses that captured these ideas. A poet might write, "My heart is a garden, and love is the rain that falls." This line echoes the gardener analogy used by the early mystics. The poet's words become a way for listeners to feel the same love that the early Sufis described. The video will later explore how this poetry shaped the culture of Sufism. The early Sufi circles also taught the importance of silence. They would sit in a quiet room, close their eyes, and listen to their own breath. This practice is similar to a child sitting still while a parent reads a story. The child learns to listen, to feel the rhythm of words. In the same way, the mystic learns to listen to the inner voice of God. The silence is not empty, it is full of potential. The early Sufi thinkers also wrote letters to each other. In one letter, Hassan al-Basri wrote to a student, "Do not look for God in the market, but in the quiet of your heart." The story of Sufism begins in the early days of Islam, when a small group of seekers turned inward to find the hidden heart of the divine. These seekers called themselves Sufis, a name that comes from the Arabic word for wool. because they wore simple woolen robes to show their love for a plain life. The core ideas that guide their path are love, unity, and the inner self. In the quiet voice of a gentle narrator, the ideas can be laid out like a soft river that flows through history, through poetry, and into everyday life. Divine love is the first pillar. In Sufi thought, love is not just a feeling that rises and falls. It is a living force that pulls the heart toward the one. The great mystic Ibn Arabi wrote, "Love is the water of life, and the world is a garden that drinks it." He meant that love is the breath that gives life to all things. The love spoken of in Sufism is a love that sees the divine in every leaf, in every smile, in every breath. It is a love that asks the seeker to open the heart like a flower opening to the sun. A simple example can help. Imagine a child who cares for a small dog. The child feeds the pet, pats its head, and feels a warm glow when the dog wags its tail. That warm glow is a tiny glimpse of the love Sufis speak of. The child does not think about the love as a theory. The child simply feels it, and the feeling changes the way the child sees the world. In the same way, a Sufi sees the divine in the small acts of daily life. The second pillar is the oneness of being, called Wadat al-Wujud in Arabic. This idea says that everything that exists is a single reality, and that reality is the divine. Ibn Arabi called this the unity of being. He wrote, "There is no existence except the existence of God." For a Sufi, the world is not a collection of separate islands. It is a single ocean, and each wave is a name of the same ocean. The ocean does not lose its identity when a wave appears. The wave is simply the ocean in motion. A modern analogy can make this clear. Think of a student in a music class. The student learns to play a note, then joins a group, then becomes part of a whole song. When the group plays together, the student feels as if the music is one breath. The student does not lose the sense of being a person, but the sense of being part of a larger sound becomes strong. In the same way, a Sufi feels that the self is a note in the grand music of the divine. The third pillar is the inner heart, often called the qalb. The heart in Sufi language is not just an organ that pumps blood. It is a spiritual center where love and knowledge meet. The master Al-Hujwari, also known as the Kashf al-Majib, taught that the heart must be cleaned of dust and ego before it can reflect the divine light. He said, "When the heart is pure, the world becomes a mirror of God." The work of cleaning the heart is called tazkiyah, which means purification. It is a daily practice of remembering God, of being kind, and of looking inside. History gives many stories that show how these ideas lived. One famous story is the meeting of the poet Rumi and the wandering dervish Shams of Tabriz. Rumi was a respected teacher who spent his days teaching law and theology. One day Shams entered the town, and his wild questions shook Rumi's calm world. Rumi felt a sudden rush of love that he could not name. He wrote, "I have become a reed that has been cut from the reed bed, and I have no home but the breath of the wind." The love that Rumi felt for Shams turned his poetry into a river of longing for the divine. The poem he wrote after that meeting is still read today as a perfect picture of divine love. Another story tells of a Sufi master named Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani and a thief who broke into his house at night. The thief stole a few pieces of cloth and fled. The next morning, the master called the thief to his door. He asked the thief why he had stolen. The thief said he was hungry. The master smiled, gave the thief a full meal and said, "The heart that steals from others will never find peace." The thief left with a full belly and a changed heart. This story shows how love and unity can turn a harsh act into a chance for growth. These stories are not just legends. They illustrate how love, unity, and the inner heart work together in real life. When love is felt deeply, it opens the heart. When the heart is open, the sense of oneness becomes clear. When oneness is clear, actions become gentle and forgiving. Even today, the ideas of Sufism find a place in modern life. A therapist who uses mindfulness may ask a client to notice the breath, to notice the feeling of love for a pet, and to see how that feeling connects the client to a larger sense of peace. In a classroom, a teacher may ask students to listen to each other's ideas as if they were part of one song. In both cases, the teacher is using the Sufi idea that the inner heart can be a bridge to a larger reality. Some people raise objections to these ideas. One common claim is that love is just an emotion, a chemical reaction in the brain, and that it does not point to anything deeper. A second claim is that saying everything is one denies the value of each individual person, that it erases personal identity. The first objection can be answered by looking at how love works in Sufi practice. Love in Sufism is not a fleeting feeling. It is a disciplined path. Seeker repeats the name of God, breathes it, and lets it settle in the heart. Over time, the feeling becomes steadier, like a candle that does not flicker in wind. The love that grows from this practice changes how a person sees the world, not just how the brain releases dopamine. The love is a guide that points to a deeper reality, not just a temporary high. The second objection can be answered by noting that unity does not erase individuality. Ibn Arabi used the image of a garden. Each flower has its own color, scent, and shape, yet all belong to the same garden. The garden is one, but the flowers are many. In Sufi thought, each person is a unique expression of the divine, like a note in a song. The song is whole, but each note matters. Unity, therefore, celebrates individuality as part of a larger whole, not as a loss of self. Real-world applications of these ideas can be seen in many places. In community work, volunteers often speak of feeling a deep love for the people they help. That love moves them to act without expecting reward. In music therapy, patients report feeling one with the rhythm, and that feeling helps them heal. Both examples echo the Sufi belief that love and unity can change actions and bring peace. Modern scholars also bring fresh eyes to these old ideas. Some say that the Sufi concept of the inner heart is similar to what psychologists call the self-compassion practice. Others compare the unity of being to the scientific idea that all matter is made of the same particles, suggesting that the ancient idea of oneness has a modern echo. Even in technology, people talk about networked consciousness, a sense that each device is linked to a larger system, a picture that resembles the Sufi view of a single divine reality. Quotes from the original sources help keep the voice clear. Rumi wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." This line shows how pain can become a doorway for love. Ibn Arabi said, "The lover sees the beloved in every breath." Al-Ghazali reminded his readers, "The heart that knows God never feels lonely." Each quote adds a simple, vivid image that can be heard in a calm voice. To bring the ideas home, imagine a person who cares for a pet dog. The person feeds the dog, walks the dog, and feels joy when the dog wags its tail. That simple love can grow into a feeling that the world is kind, that there is something good in each moment. The person may then see strangers as friends, because the love for the dog opened the heart. That is the first step of Sufi love. Now imagine a student in a music class. The student watches the teacher, listens to other students, and feels the rhythm in the chest. When the group plays together, the student feels as if the music is a single river. The student stops thinking about "I am playing" and starts thinking "we are playing." That feeling is the modern echo of unity. The student does not lose the sense of being a person. Instead, the person becomes a note in a larger song. Both examples show how the core concepts of love, unity, and the inner heart can appear in daily life. They also show how the ideas are not far away from modern experiences. The next part of the video will look at how Sufi rituals, such as the whirling dance and the chanting of names, help the heart move from a quiet state to a bright one. Those practices are tools that guide the seeker toward the same love, unity, and inner clarity that have been spoken about for centuries. In summary, the philosophy of Sufism rests on three simple ideas. Divine love is a living force that opens the heart. The oneness of being shows that all things are part of a single reality, like waves in an ocean. The inner heart is the place where love and unity meet, and it can be cleaned through daily remembrance. Historical anecdotes from Rumi's meeting with Shams and from a forgiving master illustrate how these ideas work in real life. Counter-arguments about love being just emotion or unity erasing individuality are answered by showing that love in Sufism is disciplined and that unity celebrates each unique expression. Real-world examples of pet love and music class unity bring the concepts to the present. Modern thinkers see echoes of these ideas in psychology, science, and technology. Quotes from Rumi, Ibn Arabi, and Al-Ghazali give voice to the ancient wisdom. The stage is set for the next section, where rituals will be explored as the practical path that leads the heart toward love, unity, and inner peace. The soft hum of a crowd in an old market can turn into a steady chant, and a quiet room can fill with the sound of a single name repeated over and over. That simple act of remembering is called dhikr, the Arabic word for remembrance. In Sufi circles, dhikr is more than a prayer. It is a daily practice that ties the heart to the divine. The practice began in the early days of Islam, when a group of seekers gathered around the Prophet Muhammad and repeated his name to keep their thoughts steady. Over centuries, those seekers turned the repetition into a rhythm that could be spoken aloud, whispered, or even sung with drums and flutes. The goal was always the same: to bring the mind back from wandering thoughts and settle it on a single point, much like a child might repeat a calming phrase before a test to calm nerves. Jalaluddin Rumi, the 13th century poet of Konya, described dhikr in a way that still feels fresh today. He wrote, "When the heart is silent, the world sings." In his view, the silence of the heart is not an empty void, but a space that lets the divine music flow in. Rumi's own practice involved long sessions of chanting the name of God while he moved his hands in graceful circles. He believed that each breath, each word, each gesture could open a small door in the soul, allowing light to slip through. Another key figure, Baha'u'ddin Naqshband, lived a few centuries later in the region of Bukhara. He taught a form of silent dhikr that could be done while walking the streets of a bustling bazaar. Naqshband said, "The breath of the world is the breath of the divine." For him, the simple act of breathing in rhythm with a whispered name turned the ordinary act of walking into a moving prayer. In Ottoman bazaars, merchants would pause their bargaining to repeat a short phrase, and the sound would ripple through the stalls like a gentle wind. This spread of dhikr chants turned the market into a living prayer hall, showing how the practice could move from a private room to a public square. The second practice that often catches the eye of a viewer is the whirling dance of the Mevlevi dervishes. The story of how this dance began is linked to a moment of deep grief. In 1273, Rumi's son, Sultan Walad, witnessed his father's death and felt the world collapse. In his sorrow, he began to spin, turning his body in a slow circle while reciting the name of God. The motion seemed to lift his spirit out of the darkness. Soon other followers joined, and the spinning became a shared ritual. The order that grew from this act was called the Mevlevi order, named after Rumi's title, Mevlana, which means our master. The order officially set up its base in Konya, a city in present-day Turkey, where a small hall was turned into a lodge for the dancers. The lodge soon became a place where people could come to watch the whirling and feel a sense of calm settle over them, as if the motion itself could smooth out the rough edges of daily life. The whirling dervish does not spin without purpose. The dance is built on 4 parts that match the stages of a spiritual journey. First, the dancer bows, turning away from the world. Then he lifts his arms, one hand pointing up toward the divine, the other down toward the earth. The spin itself represents the turning of the inner self toward the divine. Finally, the dancer gently returns to a still stance, as if the circle has closed and the heart has found its center. In this way, the dance is a moving meditation that helps the practitioner feel a direct link between body and spirit. Poetry is the third pillar of the Sufi practice discussed here. Rumi's verses are famous for their vivid images and simple language that still speak to modern readers. One of his most quoted lines is, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." In this line, the poet uses a small image of a wound to talk about how pain can become a doorway for growth. The poem is not just a literary work. It is a tool for feeling. When a student repeats a line like, "The wound is the place where the light enters you," before a difficult exam, the words can calm fear and turn anxiety into a sense of purpose. The same effect can happen when a child spins on a playground, feeling the world blur for a moment. The child's dizzy feeling is a physical echo of the dervish whirling, a simple way to understand how motion can bring a brief sense of the infinite. Modern scholars often compare Sufi poetry to the songs of a folk singer. The poet takes a simple tune and adds a new verse that reflects the current mood of the listener. In today's world, many people turn to Rumi's verses on their phones, using them as daily reminders. A person might set a reminder that reads, "When you feel lost, remember the garden within and read it each morning." The practice of reading a short poem to start the day works much like the ancient practice of dhikr, turning a moment of silence into a moment of focus. The core ideas behind dhikr, whirling, and poetry are all about inner focus. Critics sometimes claim that these practices are mere superstition or distraction. One common argument says that chanting a name over and over does not bring a person closer to truth, but only creates a habit that feels good without real meaning. Another argument says that spinning can cause dizziness and may even lead to physical harm, turning a spiritual act into a risky stunt. These objections are understandable, especially for people who value rational, step-by-step methods. The first counter-argument can be answered by looking at how the brain responds to repetition. When a person repeats a phrase, the mind's wandering thoughts begin to quiet. Scientists have found that this quieting can lower stress hormones and help the heart beat more slowly. In the same way, daika can create a calm state that lets the person think more clearly, not less. The practice is not about believing in a magic word, but about training the mind to stay present. The second counter-argument about whirling can be answered by noting that the dervishes do not spin without preparation. They learn to keep their balance by focusing on a fixed point inside themselves, much like a tightrope walker who looks at a spot on the horizon to stay steady. The spin is done slowly at first, and the dancer builds strength and control over time. The result is a feeling of lightness, not a loss of control. Historical anecdotes help to see how these practices grew beyond small circles. When the Mevlevi order was first established in Konya, the city's ruler, Sultan Kayqubad I, invited the dervishes to perform for the court. The Sultan was so moved that he granted them a garden where they could practice their whirling and daika in peace. The garden became a place where travelers from far lands could watch the dance, and the sight of the spinning robes inspired poets in other regions to write verses about the unity of motion and spirit. Over the next few decades, the order spread across the Ottoman Empire, and each new lodge added its own local flavor to the practice. But the core of daika and whirling remained the same. In another story from the 16th century, a group of Naqshbandi followers set up a small house near the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul. They began each morning by walking through the market, whispering the name of God with each step. Merchants who passed by started to join in, and soon the entire market resonated with a low chant that rose above the clatter of carts. The chant became known as the Bazaar Dika, and it helped keep the traders calm during the hectic rush of buying and selling. The practice showed that daika could be woven into daily life, turning ordinary work into a shared spiritual moment. To make these ideas more relatable, imagine a student who feels nervous before a big test. The student might stand still, close the eyes, and repeat the phrase, peace within, peace without, 3 times. Each repetition draws the mind away from the fear of failure and into a calm center. This is a modern version of daika, using a simple phrase instead of a traditional name. The practice does not guarantee a perfect score, but it gives the student a tool to manage anxiety, just as a dervish uses whirling to calm the storm inside. Another everyday picture is a child who runs to the playground, climbs onto a merry-go-round, and spins until the world blurs. The child's laughter and the dizzy feeling are a natural expression of the same motion that the dervishes use in their ritual. The child does not think about spiritual ideas, but the body's response, balance, breath, focus, mirrors the deeper practice. By seeing the child spin as a simple version of whirling, the viewer can understand how movement can open a small window to inner stillness. Analogies can help to bridge the gap between ancient practice and modern life. Think of daika as a flashlight in a dark room. When the room is dark, the mind can wander into corners where fear hides. Turning on the flashlight, repeating a phrase, illuminates those corners and shows that there is nothing to fear. The light does not change the room, but it changes how the room is seen. Whirling can be compared to a spinning top. When a top spins fast, it stays upright and does not wobble. The motion creates a balance that keeps the top steady. In the same way, the dervish spin creates a balance in the heart, allowing thoughts to settle instead of wobbling. The poetry of the Sufis serves as a bridge between feeling and thought. A line from Rumi: "Your heart is the size of a small lantern. Let it shine," invites the reader to picture a tiny light in the dark. The image is easy to hold, and it encourages the reader to imagine their own heart as a source of gentle light. When a person carries that image through the day, it can shape how they react to stress, much like a mantra can shape a mood. The poet's role is not just to create beautiful words, but to give the listener a simple picture that can be held in the mind during moments of need. Baha'u'ddin Naqshband also used poetry to teach. He wrote, "The river does not argue with the stone. It simply flows around it." This line explains a deep idea: acceptance, using a clear image of water moving past a rock. A student who feels blocked by a difficult problem can recall this line and see the problem as a stone, letting the mind flow around it instead of fighting it. The poetry becomes a mental tool, not just a decorative line. Both Rumi and Naqshband left many sayings that are still quoted today. Rumi's famous quote, "What you seek is seeking you," reminds listeners that the search for meaning is not a one-way road. The universe also moves toward the seeker. Naqshband's advice: "When the heart is pure, the world is pure," suggests that inner clarity can change how the outer world appears. These quotes are often used in modern self-help books, showing how Sufi ideas have traveled far beyond the original circles. The practices of Daika, whirling. The story of Sufi ethics begins with a simple idea: the inner path must show itself in outer deeds. From the earliest days of the tradition, teachers said that love for the divine must become love for fellow humans. This view is not a later addition. It is woven into the very roots of Sufism. The first Sufi masters spoke of the heart as a mirror that reflects the light of God. Ghazali, a great scholar of the 11th century, wrote that the purpose of the spiritual journey is to become a source of mercy for the world. He said, "The heart is the throne of God. When it is clean, the world becomes a garden of kindness." This sentence captures the link between inner purity and outward kindness. Ghazali's book Ihya al-Din, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, contains many chapters on how a seeker should treat others. He lists humility, generosity, truth, and patience as the main virtues. He explains humility as the feeling that one is a small part of a larger whole, not as a feeling of low self-worth. In this way, humility becomes a tool for service, because a humble person can see the need of another without ego blocking the view. Another key figure, Ibn Arabi, added the idea that the divine presence lives in every creature. He wrote, "All existence is a single body. The wound of one is the wound of all." This statement makes the moral duty of a Sufi clear: to heal the wounds of others. The language is poetic, but the meaning is plain. If every person carries a spark of the divine, then hurting another is like hurting the divine itself. The moral logic follows without needing complex theory. Hazrat Inayat Khan, a modern teacher who brought Sufi ideas to the West in the early 20th century, kept the same focus on service. He taught that the true religion is love, and that love must be expressed in everyday acts. He said, "When you help a neighbor carry groceries, you lift a piece of heaven onto the earth." This quote shows how a small act becomes a spiritual practice. Inayat Khan also spoke of honesty in games, saying that a fair move is a mirror of the inner truth. He used the example of a child who refuses to cheat in a board game, even when the chance to win is high. The child's choice reflects the inner commitment to truth, and the lesson spreads to larger decisions in adult life. The everyday examples help listeners see how Sufi ethics fit into daily life. Imagine a person who sees an elderly neighbor struggling with heavy bags. The Sufi teaching says that offering help is not a duty imposed by law, but an expression of the love that lives inside. The act of lifting the bags becomes a small prayer, a way to let the inner light shine outward. In another scene, a teenager playing a card game feels the urge to hide a winning card. The Sufi principle of honesty says that the teenager should put the card on the table, because the inner peace that follows is worth more than any short-term win. Historical anecdotes give weight to these ideas. In the city of Fez, Morocco, a Sufi lodge called a Zawiya ran a kitchen that fed hundreds of poor people each day. The kitchen was not a charity project run by a ruler. It was a daily practice of the Sufi masters who lived there. They believed that feeding the hungry was a direct way to feed the divine. The kitchen's fire never went out, and the scent of bread became a symbol of mercy in the city. Travelers who passed by wrote in their journals that the smell of the kitchen was the breath of God among the streets. This story shows how the abstract teaching of generosity became a concrete service that changed a whole community. A second anecdote comes from Persia in the 13th century. A Sufi sheikh named Sadid al-Din al-Qushayri was asked to mediate a dispute between two rival tribes. The tribes had been fighting over water rights for years, and the conflict threatened the lives of many villagers. The sheikh gathered the leaders in a garden, sat quietly, and invited each side to speak. He listened without interrupting, and then he reminded them that the water they fought over was a gift from the same creator. He offered a plan that shared the water fairly and asked each tribe to plant a tree as a sign of peace. The agreement was signed, and the garden became a place where the two groups met each year to celebrate the new pact. This peace negotiation shows that Sufi ethics are not limited to personal piety. They can guide public matters and bring lasting harmony. These stories answer a common criticism that mystics ignore social duty. Some critics claim that Sufis spend all their time in meditation and never engage with the world. The counterpoint is clear when looking at the daily work of Sufi orders. The kitchens, the schools, the hospitals, and the peace talks all demonstrate that Sufi practice includes active outreach. The mystic's inner work is meant to produce outward action, not to hide from it. When a Sufi says that the heart must be clean, the cleaning process includes washing the streets of injustice. Another objection says that Sufi ethics are just a set of rules, like any other moral code. Critics argue that the language of love and humility is poetic, but does not give concrete guidance. The response lies in the way Sufi teachers turn abstract ideas into lived habits. Al-Ghazali, for example, did not leave the reader with a list of rules. He gave daily exercises. He suggested that each morning a seeker should ask, "What can I do today to ease another's burden?" He also recommended that before sleeping, the seeker should reflect on whether any word spoken that day hurt another. These simple practices turn the idea of kindness into a habit that shapes the whole day. Modern teachers continue this approach. Hazrat Inayat Khan's schools teach students to write a short note of gratitude each night and to find one small way to serve the community each week. The practice is not a rule imposed from outside, but a habit that grows from inner awareness. Inayat Khan also taught that the Sufi path is like a garden. The gardener must water the soil, pull the weeds, and watch the plants grow. The garden does not grow by wish alone. It needs constant care. In the same way, ethical behavior needs regular attention, not a one-time decision. Analogies help make the ideas vivid. Think of a candle in a dark room. The flame represents the inner love of the seeker. If the candle is placed on a table, its light stays small. If the candle is carried into the hallway, the light spreads and helps others see. Sufi ethics say that the seeker should carry the candle into the world, letting the light touch other lives. Another analogy is a river that runs through many villages. The river cannot stay still. It must keep moving. When the river meets a thirsty field, it gives water. When it meets a dry stone, it smooths it. The Sufi's inner love is the river, and the acts of kindness are the water that nourishes all it meets. The connection to earlier sections on love and practice is strong. The previous part of the video explained that love is the core of Sufi spirituality. This section shows that love is not an isolated feeling. It becomes practice when it moves outward. The practice of remembering God, the prayer, the chanting, all turn into a habit of serving others. When the heart is full of love, the mind naturally chooses humility, honesty, and generosity. The ethics described here are the visible side of the invisible love discussed earlier. Real-world applications extend beyond the simple examples. In many cities today, Sufi centers run food banks that serve the homeless. They organize clean-up days in neighborhoods, showing that the ancient principle of feeding the hungry still works. In schools, teachers use Sufi stories to teach children about honesty. A teacher might read the tale of the honest child in the game, and then ask the class to share a time they chose truth over a quick win. The story becomes a tool for moral education. Another modern example is the work of the international Sufi movement, which runs peace workshops in conflict zones. The facilitators use the same method as the Persian sheikh. They sit with each side, listen deeply, and remind participants that the same divine spark lives in all. They then guide the group to create a shared project, such as planting a community garden. The garden becomes a living symbol of the agreement, just as the trees planted by the Persian tribes became a sign of peace. These projects show that Sufi ethics can be applied to large social problems, not just personal choices. The teachings also speak to the digital age. When a person receives a message that could be spread as a rumor, the Sufi principle of truth advises checking the facts before sharing. The inner habit of honesty guides the click of a button. In the same way, the habit of humility can help a person listen to a different opinion online without immediately defending their own view. The practice of service can become a habit of offering help in online forums, answering questions, or donating to a cause. The ancient guidance finds a place in modern technology. Counter-arguments continue to appear in debates about mysticism. Some scholars say that the focus on inner experience leads to neglect of political action. Others claim that Sufi ethics are too vague to be useful in law or policy. The stories of the Fez kitchen and the Persian peace talks answer both points. The kitchen shows that a spiritual community can provide essential services that governments sometimes fail to deliver. The peace talk shows that a mystic can influence political decisions without wielding power, simply by offering a moral framework that all sides can accept. Another criticism is that Sufi ethics rely on the belief in God, which not everyone shares. The response is that the core ideas of kindness, humility, and service are universal. Even a non-believer can see value in the practice of helping a neighbor carry groceries. The language of Sufism frames these actions as reflections of divine love, but the actions themselves stand on their own. The Sufi master often said that the path is open to anyone who seeks truth, regardless of creed. This openness makes the ethical teachings adaptable to many cultures. The historical record also shows that Sufi orders have been involved in social reform. In the Ottoman Empire, the Mevlevi order opened schools that taught reading, writing, and mathematics to children of all backgrounds. The order also cared for the sick, establishing hospitals that accepted patients without regard to wealth. These institutions were run by mystics who believed that serving the body was part of serving the soul. The pattern repeats in many societies. When a Sufi community settles in a town, it often brings education, healthcare, and charity. The modern scholar Anna-Marie Schimmel wrote that Sufism is a religion of love that never forgets the world. This phrase sums up the balance between inner devotion and outer action. The love spoken of in earlier sections does not stay hidden. It spills over into the streets, the markets, the courts. The practice of remembering God is linked to the practice of remembering the neighbor. A final quote from Al-Ghazali ties the whole discussion together. He wrote, "The true worshipper is the one whose heart is pure and whose hands are busy in good deeds." This sentence links the inner state, pure heart, with the outer state, busy hands. It reminds the listener that ethics in Sufi thought are not a separate chapter. They are woven into the entire spiritual path. In summary, the ethics of Sufi thought rest on three pillars. The voice begins by recalling the way Sufi thinkers have described the soul as a traveler moving from darkness into light. In the early centuries of Islamic thought, mystics started to speak of a path that was not only a set of rules, but a living journey. The idea grew out of the Qur'an's call to know the inner self and the later sayings of the Prophet that speak of the heart as a lamp. From this seed, scholars such as Al-Kashani built a full map of the soul's progress. He wrote that the soul is like a candle that burns in the darkness of the heart, and that the candle must be fed by the breath of divine love. This image became the core of what later Sufi teachers called the three stations: Sharia, Tariqa, and Hakika. Sharia, the first station, is the outer law. It is the set of practices that guide a person in daily life: prayer, fasting, honesty, and charity. In the voice calm tone, it is explained that Sharia is the foundation of a house. Without a solid floor, a house cannot stand. The soul, when it first steps onto the path, learns the rhythm of the world through these actions. Kashani compared this stage to a student who learns the alphabet before reading a poem. The student must know each letter, its sound, and its shape before he can understand meaning. In the same way, a seeker learns the basic words of the faith before moving to deeper meanings. The second station, Tariqa, is the way or the method. Here the seeker begins to follow a spiritual guide, to practice meditation, to repeat divine names, and to join a community of friends. Tariqa is the middle of the journey, the road that leads out of the city streets and into the countryside. The voice tells the listener that this stage is like a traveler who has left the familiar market lanes and now walks along a country road. The traveler sees new sights, hears new sounds, and must learn to read the signs of the landscape. In the Sufi picture, the traveler learns to listen to the inner voice, to feel the pull of the divine presence, and to let go of the ego that clings to worldly pride. The third station, Hakika, is the truth. At this point, the seeker has entered the realm of direct experience. The darkness that once covered the heart begins to melt away, and the light of divine reality shines through. Kashani described Hakika as the moment when the candle's flame merges with the sun. The soul no longer looks for light, it becomes the light. This stage is like a master craftsman who can shape metal without a hammer, because the skill has become part of his very being. The voice explains that Hakika is not a final destination, but a deepening of awareness that continues to grow. The origins of this three-stage model can be traced to early Persian poetry. In the 10th century work of Attar, the allegory of the moth and the flame appears. The moth, drawn by a bright flame, flies toward it despite the danger. Attar writes, "The moth flies toward the fire, for it knows that only the fire can give it its true form." This story shows the soul's longing for the divine, even when the path looks risky. The voice uses this tale to illustrate how the seeker must be willing to risk the self in order to reach the light. Another historic anecdote comes from the 12th century mystic Ibn al-Arabi's disciple, a wandering dervish who set out for the shrine of Imam Ali in Najaf. The journey took him across deserts, through towns where he faced suspicion, and finally to the holy tomb. When he arrived, he fell to his knees and said, "I have walked from the outer world into the inner garden of the heart." This pilgrimage mirrors the three stations. The desert trek represents Sharia, the careful steps through towns represent Tariqa, and the arrival at the shrine represents Hakika. The voice describes the scene in vivid detail, letting the listener feel the heat of the sand, the sound of prayer calls, and the quiet peace at the shrine. Modern interpreters have taken these ideas and placed them in today's world. Scholars such as Sayyid Hossein Nasr speak of the soul's journey as a model for ecological stewardship. He says that when the heart sees the world as a reflection of the divine light, it will protect the earth. Contemporary teachers also use the metaphor of learning a skill, such as playing a musical instrument. At first, a student learns the notes and the rhythm, Sharia. Then the student practices scales, improvises, and feels the music, Tariqa. Finally, the musician can play a piece without thinking, letting the music flow from within, Hakika. The voice repeats this example to make the abstract ideas concrete for a modern audience. Another real-world application appears in psychology. Therapists who use mindfulness techniques often speak of moving from surface thoughts to deeper awareness. The first step is to notice the breath, similar to Sharia's focus on external practice. The second step is to observe thoughts without judgment, like Tariqa's inner work. The final step is to experience a sense of unity with the present moment, echoing Hakika's direct experience of truth. By linking Sufi metaphysics to modern mental health, the voice shows that the ancient path still offers tools for today's challenges. The voice now turns to the counter-arguments that some critics raise. The first criticism claims that the journey of the soul is just a fantasy, a story for poets with no real basis. To answer this, the voice offers a simple analogy. Imagine a child learning to ride a bicycle. At first, the child believes the bike cannot move without a rider. Over time, the child feels the balance, the wind, the motion, and knows that the bike can indeed glide. The child's belief becomes a lived reality. In the same way, the Sufi path moves from a story told by teachers to a lived experience felt by seekers. The belief in the soul's ascent is not a made-up tale. It becomes a reality through practice, just as the child's belief becomes real through riding. The second criticism says that the Sufi path denies science, that it asks believers to ignore the material world. The voice refutes this by pointing to the way scientists describe the process of learning. In physics, a particle can exist in many possible states until it is observed. Observation changes the particle, revealing a deeper truth about its nature. Similarly, the Sufi seeker observes the inner self, and that observation brings about a change in consciousness. The journey does not reject the material world. It adds a layer of meaning that science alone does not address. The voice reminds the listener that many modern physicists, such as Niels Bohr, have spoken of the complementarity of the observed and the observer, a concept that resonates with the Sufi view of outer practice and inner reality. Quotes from primary sources are woven throughout the narrative. Kashani wrote, "The heart is a garden. The soul is the gardener who must clear the weeds of desire to let the roses of truth bloom." Rumi, the beloved 13th century poet, said, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." These lines are spoken slowly, letting each word settle. The voice also cites Ibn Arabi, who declared, "The seeker who reaches the station of Haqiqah becomes the mirror that reflects the divine." By repeating these verses, the script gives the viewer a taste of the original language that shaped the ideas. The voice also revisits earlier sections on the inner self, reminding the audience that the soul's darkness is not a permanent state, but a cloud that can be lifted. It notes that later sections will explore how the Sufi view of the soul influences modern art, music, and even technology. For example, the concept of a user interface that guides a person from simple commands to a seamless flow mirrors the three stations: basic commands, sharia; intermediate shortcuts, tariqah; and the intuitive experience, haqiqah. This connection shows that the ancient map still helps to design new tools. The journey of the soul, as described by Sufi metaphysics, is presented as a living path that can be walked by anyone willing to move step by step. The voice paints the picture of a student who first learns the alphabet, then reads simple stories, and finally writes original poetry. Each stage builds on the previous one, and each stage is necessary. The traveler who leaves the noisy city streets, climbs a winding mountain path, and finally reaches the summit experiences a view that cannot be described in words, only felt. The view is the light of Haqiqah, the truth that the seeker sought. In the final moments of the segment, the voice invites the listener to imagine their own path. The listener is asked to picture a candle in a dark room, the flame flickering as it draws near a brighter light. The listener is asked to feel the pull of that brighter light, to notice the warmth, to let the flame grow. The voice assures that the path is not a lonely climb. It is shared by countless seekers across centuries, from the poet in a Persian garden to the modern student in a university lecture hall. The journey from darkness to light, from sharia to tariqah to haqiqah, remains a map for any soul that wishes to move beyond the surface and touch the deeper reality that Sufi mystics have spoken of for generations. The story of Sufism is a story of love that moves across borders like a gentle wind. It begins in the deserts of Persia, where early mystics first spoke of a heart that seeks the divine. Those early voices found a home in the language of poetry, in the rhythm of music, and in the quiet of prayer. The first major figure that the narrator mentions is Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, a man who lived in the 9th century in Baghdad. He taught that the path to God is not only through strict law, but also through inner love and compassion. He said, "The heart is a candle that burns for the beloved." His words spread far beyond the walls of his city. From Baghdad, the teachings traveled eastward along trade routes that linked the Middle East with the Indian subcontinent. One of the most vivid examples of that travel is the story of Amir Khusrau, a poet and musician who lived in the 13th century in Delhi. Khusrau grew up in a Persian family that had moved to India after the Mongol invasions. He learned the language of the court, but he also learned the songs of the Sufi masters who gathered in the city's gardens. He wrote, "The garden of the heart is where the rose of love blooms." His verses mixed Persian and local Indian words, showing how Sufi ideas could blend with new cultures without losing their core. The spread of Sufi orders in Mughal India provides a clear historical anecdote of how the tradition took root in a new land. The Mughal Emperor Akbar, who ruled in the 16th century, invited many Sufi masters to his court. He gave land to the Chishti order, which taught that service to the poor is a form of worship. The Chishti Dargah, or shrine, in Ajmer became a place where people of all faiths came to pray, eat, and share stories. The emperor's support allowed the order to build schools, hospitals, and kitchens that fed travelers. In this way, Sufism became part of the social fabric of the empire. The narrator points out that the earlier section on practice described how Sufi gatherings include poetry, music, and shared meals. The story of Ajmer shows those practices in action, and it also ties to the ethics of generosity that were discussed earlier. Another anecdote shows the modern side of the journey. In the early 20th century, a wave of Western poets discovered the work of the Persian mystic Rumi. The poet and translator Coleman Barks, for example, heard Rumi's verses at a small reading in New York and felt an immediate pull. He later wrote, "Rumi's words are a mirror that reflects the soul's own longing." The interest spread quickly among literary circles in Europe and America. By the 1970s, a small group of poets in London formed a reading club that met in a tea house. They shared Rumi's poems while sipping chai, a drink that reminded them of the spice routes that once carried Sufi ideas eastward. This modern anecdote shows how a centuries-old mystic can still speak to people in a new language. The path from the Middle East to the West also includes the story of Kabir Helminski, a contemporary teacher who lives in the United States. Helminski grew up in a family that moved from Poland to America after the war. He discovered Sufism while studying comparative religion at university. He later traveled to Turkey, where he studied with a living master of the Mevlevi order, the whirling dervishes who keep Rumi's legacy alive through dance. Helminski now runs a center in New York that offers weekly daika, a practice of remembering God through repeated phrases. He also writes books that translate Sufi concepts into everyday language. In his own words, "The heart can be a garden, no matter where the soil is." His work shows that Sufi ideas can adapt to modern city life while still keeping the same core of love and remembrance. To make these big ideas feel close to everyday life, the narrator offers two relatable examples. First, a family from Iran moves to Canada and brings a traditional stew recipe with them. The mother teaches her children how to blend the spices, and she tells the story of a Sufi saint who used cooking as a form of prayer. The children learn that the act of sharing food can be a way to share love, just as Sufi masters taught. Second, a high school student in London joins a meditation club after hearing a friend talk about mindful breathing. The club meets after school in a quiet room and practices a simple breathing exercise that a Sufi teacher once described as the breath of the beloved. The student finds that the practice helps with anxiety and also sparks an interest in learning about the poetry of Rumi. Both examples show how Sufi ideas can appear in ordinary moments, linking back to the earlier discussion of ethics that emphasized compassion for self and others. The journey of Sufism also raises questions. Some critics argue that when Sufi ideas move into new cultures, they become diluted and lose authenticity. They say that mixing local music or language turns the original teachings into a marketable product. Another criticism claims that Sufism is just a modern fad, a trendy way for people to feel spiritual without real depth. The narrator presents these counter-arguments and then answers them with clear evidence. First, the claim of dilution is examined. The spread of Sufi orders in South Asia created new forms of poetry, music, and dance that still kept the core aim of love for the divine. The Chishti order, for example, kept the practice of sama, a listening ceremony where music is used to open the heart. Even though the instruments changed from Persian lutes to Indian sitars, the intention stayed the same. Moreover, many Sufi institutions have survived for centuries. The Nizamuddin Shrine in Delhi, founded by the great saint Nizamuddin Aulia in the 13th century, still receives visitors today. The shrine runs a langar, a free kitchen that feeds thousands each day. Its continued operation shows that the teachings have not been reduced to a fashion, but remain a living social force. Second, the fad argument is answered by pointing to the lasting institutions that keep Sufi practice alive. In Africa, the Qadiriya order, named after Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, established schools and community centers that have operated for over 300 years. In West Africa, the order's teachings are woven into the daily life of towns, where people gather for weekly dhikr and for community decisions. In the West, the same pattern appears. The Sufi Center in New York, founded by Kabir Helminski, has been running for more than 20 years. It offers regular classes, publishes books, and maintains a network of teachers who travel across the United States. The fact that these institutions have persisted for decades, not months, disproves the idea that Sufi interest is a passing trend. The narrator also connects these points to the earlier sections on practice and ethics. The practice section described how dhikr, poetry, and service form the core of a Sufi life. The ethics section explained how love, humility, and generosity guide behavior. The stories of the Iranian family sharing stew, the school meditation club, and the Mughal Dargah all show practice in action and ethical outcomes. The modern example of Kabir Helminski's center shows how practice and ethics continue to shape communities today. The spread of Sufi ideas across cultures can be compared to a river that finds many bends but always moves toward the sea. In Persia, the river began as a small stream of mystic thought. As it traveled through the mountains of Central Asia, it gathered new tributaries of language and music. When it entered the plains of India, it widened, feeding villages with water for crops and for the soul. When it reached the coasts of Africa, it mixed with local rhythms, creating new songs that still carried the same current. In the modern West, the river meets concrete and steel, but it still finds cracks where it can flow, filling parks and coffee shops with quiet moments of remembrance. This analogy helps the listener see how a single idea can keep its shape while taking on new forms. The story also includes direct quotes from primary sources that illustrate the heart of Sufi teaching. Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani once wrote, "The love of God is a fire that does not burn the heart, but purifies it." Amir Khusrau sang, "When the heart opens, the world becomes a garden of roses." Rumi, whose verses traveled across centuries, said, "When you do things from your soul, you feel a river moving in you." These short sayings capture the essence of the path and show why people keep returning to them. The narrator also mentions how Sufi ideas have shaped literature beyond poetry. In the 20th century, the poet William Butler Yeats wrote about the mystic song after reading Rumi. He said, "The ancient whisper of love reaches across time." The poet Langston Hughes, too, quoted Rumi in a speech about freedom, noting that the heart that knows love cannot be chained. These references show that the influence of Sufi thought is not limited to religious circles, but reaches the broader world of art and ideas. The spread of Sufi orders in Mughal India also includes a specific episode that illustrates how a ruler's support helped the tradition grow. When Emperor Shah Jahan, famous for building the Taj Mahal, visited the shrine of Moinuddin Chishti in Ajmer, he offered a large sum of money to repair the dome. He then ordered that a caravanserai, a place for travelers, be built nearby. The caravanserai gave merchants a safe place to rest, and the merchants in turn spread stories of the shrine's hospitality along the Silk Road. This episode shows how political support can help a spiritual movement become part of daily life for many people. In Africa, the Qadiriyya order's spread is illustrated by the story of a Senegalese village in the early 19th century. A traveling Sufi teacher arrived with a small group of followers. He taught the villagers a simple prayer that repeated the name of God. The villagers began to meet every evening under a large baobab tree to chant together. Over time, the teacher helped the village set up a small school where children learned to read Arabic and to write poetry. The school still exists today, and the village holds an annual festival that celebrates both the local harvest and the Sufi tradition. This anecdote shows how Sufi ideas can blend with local customs while creating lasting institutions. The modern Western interest in Rumi can also be traced through a specific literary event. In 1975, a small group of poets gathered at a bookstore in San Francisco for a reading of Rumi's verses, translated by Coleman Barks. The event was advertised as a night of Persian love. The audience, mostly young people seeking spiritual depth, responded with quiet applause after each poem. One listener later said that the reading changed the way she viewed her own life, making her feel that love was a universal language. The reading sparked a series of workshops, book clubs, and even a small meditation circle that used Rumi's poetry as a guide. This chain of events shows how a single translation can ignite a movement that lasts for decades. The narrator also highlights how Sufi ideas have entered popular culture in subtle ways. In many cities, cafes display calligraphy of Rumi's verses on their walls. In music, artists blend Sufi chants with modern beats, creating songs that play on radio stations. These trends are not just decorative. They often carry the message of love, humility, and service. When a listener hears a song that repeats Allahu Akbar, God is great, in a pop arrangement, the message of the divine's greatness is still being shared, even if the listener does not know the history behind it. This demonstrates how Sufi ideas can travel quietly, like a seed carried on the wind. The cross-cultural journey of Sufism also raises a question about identity. Some people wonder whether a Sufi who lives in New York and speaks English can still be called a traditional Sufi. The answer lies in the core of the teachings. The early masters said that the outward form is less important than the inner state. Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani wrote, "The heart that loves is the same in any land." When a teacher in New York encourages students to remember God in a simple phrase, the discussion now turns to the questions that have followed Sufism since its first rise. Earlier, the video explained the core ideas of love, inner search, and ethical conduct. Those ideas sit at the heart of the tradition, but they have also drawn sharp criticism from many directions. The criticism can be grouped into three main streams: the voice of orthodox scholars, the voice of modern secular thinkers, and the voice of Sufi practitioners themselves. Each voice asks a different set of questions, yet all of them share a common concern about the safety of belief and practice. Orthodox scholars have long warned that some Sufi practices stray from the clear teachings of the Qur'an and the Sunnah. The most famous early critic is Ibn Taymiyyah, a 14th-century jurist who wrote extensively about what he saw as dangerous innovations. He wrote, "The Sufi is a deceiver who hides heresy behind the veil of mysticism." For Ibn Taymiyyah, the danger lay in the use of poetry, music, and ecstatic prayer that seemed to replace the plain worship prescribed by the law. He argued that such practices could lead believers away from the clear path and open the door to false doctrines. He also feared that Sufi masters could claim special knowledge that put them above ordinary scholars, creating a hierarchy that the law does not allow. Another early scholar, Al-Ghazali, while himself a Sufi, also warned against excess. He cautioned that the seeker must keep the heart pure and avoid any practice that could be mistaken for shirk, the sin of associating partners with God. In his own words, "The heart must be guarded as a garden. If weeds are allowed, the garden will die." This warning shows that even within the tradition, there has been a strong sense that the path must stay within the limits of orthodoxy. The modern secular critique often comes from thinkers who see all religious mysticism as a form of superstition. The biologist Richard Dawkins has said, "Mystical experiences are brain tricks that give a false sense of truth." For Dawkins, Sufi visions, whirling dances, and poetic metaphors are simply the result of neural patterns that can be explained without reference to the divine. He adds that such experiences can be used to justify any number of untested claims. In the same vein, the philosopher Sam Harris writes, "When people claim direct contact with the divine, they often escape the need for evidence." Harris' view is that Sufi claims of inner illumination cannot be tested and therefore should be treated with the same skepticism as any other supernatural claim. Both of these modern voices share a concern that Sufi language can be vague enough to hide dangerous ideas. They point to the way Sufis sometimes speak of the beloved or the hidden truth as a way to avoid direct theological debate. Critics argue that this lack of clarity can let false doctrines spread unnoticed. Inside the tradition, there have also been fierce debates. Some Sufis argue that the outer law, Sharia, and inner love must be united, while others say that the inner path can sometimes stand apart from the law. One famous internal dispute arose in the 19th century over the use of music in worship. The Naqshbandi order, known for its silence and strict adherence to the law, opposed the use of music, while the Qadiriyya order embraced it as a way to lift the heart toward God. The debate played out in many cities, but a key moment happened in Delhi in 1864 when a public council of scholars met to decide whether the use of the knee, a reed flute, could be allowed in Sufi gatherings. The council eventually issued a split decision. One faction said the music was permissible if it led to remembrance of God. The other said it was a distraction that could lead to indulgence. The disagreement showed how, even within Sufism, the balance between law and love can be fragile. A second internal dispute dates back to the 13th century ban of certain orders in Baghdad. After the Mongol invasion, the new rulers tried to bring order to a city full of competing religious groups. The authorities issued a decree that banned the Shadhili and Suhrawardi orders, accusing them of secret gatherings that threatened public order. The ban sparked a secret resistance among the Sufis, who continued to meet in hidden rooms and garden pavilions. The story of the hidden garden in Baghdad became a symbol of the tension between authority and inner devotion. It also illustrated how external pressure can force a tradition to adapt, sometimes by moving its practices underground. These historical episodes help to see why the critique of Sufism is not just an academic exercise. The story of the banned orders reads like a child asking why a bedtime story has been taken away. Imagine a child who loves a story about brave knights and asks, "Why can't I hear it tonight? Who decided it is not allowed?" The child's question is simple, but it opens a world of power, control, and imagination. In the same way, the ban in Baghdad asked the Sufis to explain why their inner stories could be silenced by the outside world. A modern workplace analogy can also make the issue clear. Picture a worker who follows a company rule that says, "No music in the office." The rule is meant to keep focus, but the worker knows that a soft song helps them think better. The worker asks, "Why must I stay silent when the music helps me do my job?" The worker's question mirrors the Sufi's question about why certain practices must be forbidden when they feel they bring them closer to the divine. Both the child and the worker ask for the reason behind a rule, and both may find that the rule was made for reasons that do not fit their personal experience. The external critics, both orthodox and secular, often present two main accusations. The first is that Sufism is heretical, meaning it deviates from the core teachings of Islam. The second is that Sufism is superstitious, meaning it relies on magical thinking rather than reason. To understand these accusations, it helps to look at the language used by the critics. Ibn Taymiyyah's phrase, "deceiver who hides heresy behind mysticism," combines the charge of heresy with the charge of deception. Modern skeptics use words like brain trick to suggest that the experiences are not real, but merely mental tricks. In response, Sufi defenders have offered clear counter-arguments. The first counter-argument says that Sufism does not reject the law. It simply seeks to live the law with a deeper heart. A Sufi might say, the law is the outer shape, the heart is the inner shape. Both are needed for a healthy life. This answer points out that many Sufi practices, such as the 5 daily prayers, are exactly the same as those of any other Muslim. The difference lies in the intention, which is to feel the presence of God in each act. By showing that the outward actions are identical, the defender argues that the accusation of heresy does not hold. The second counter-argument tackles the charge of superstition. It says that Sufi experiences are not magical spells, but personal reflections on the same reality that all humans share. A Sufi might explain, when a poet says the heart is a garden, he is using a picture to help people feel what the heart can become. This explanation shows that the language of love and light is a tool, not a claim that the world is full of hidden forces. The defender also points to the long tradition of Sufi scholars who wrote about the mind, the heart, and the soul in ways that anticipate modern psychology. By linking the inner work of Sufism to everyday mental health, the defender argues that the practice is rational, not superstitious. Both counter-arguments rely on everyday language and on linking the inner work of Sufism to ordinary life. They also tie back to the core concepts introduced earlier, such as the idea that love for the divine can shape ethical behavior. When a Sufi says that love makes one honest, generous, and patient, that claim can be tested by looking at the lives of many Sufi saints who were known for feeding the poor, caring for the sick, and protecting travelers. Those actions show that the inner path can produce real, observable good. The debate also includes the question of authority. Some critics argue that Sufi masters claim a special status that puts them above ordinary scholars. Ibn Taymiyyah wrote, "When a man claims to see the hidden, he places himself above the law." The Sufi response is that the master is not above the law, but is a guide who helps others see the law's deeper meaning. The master's role is compared to a teacher who points out the hidden pattern in a puzzle, not to a ruler who changes the rules. Another point of contention is the use of poetry and music. Critics say that these art forms can distract believers from the serious study of scripture. The 19th century debate in Delhi highlighted this tension. Some scholars argued that the rhythm of a song can stir emotions that are not based on reason. Others replied that the rhythm can open the heart to the same truths that reason finds in the text. The debate ended without a single decision, but it left a lasting impression that the balance between feeling and thought is delicate. Historical anecdotes help to illustrate how these debates have played out in real life. The Baghdad ban of the Shadili and Suhrawardi orders showed that political power can shape religious practice. When the authorities closed the public meeting places, the Sufis moved their gatherings to private homes and garden pavilions. They whispered verses of Rumi in the night, and they kept a hidden fire of love alive. The story shows that the inner path can survive even when the outer world tries to block it. The Delhi music debate of 1864 shows. The story of Sufism began many centuries ago in the deserts of the Middle East, where seekers gathered around fire to share songs and simple prayers. Those early seekers believed that the divine was not far away, but close enough to feel in the breath of a child or the taste of fresh water. The first teachers, such as Hassan al-Basri and Rabia of Basra, spoke about love as a path that could be walked in everyday moments. Their words still echo in modern classrooms, in coffee shops, and in the quiet rooms where people keep a journal. One of the most famous early voices, the poet mystic Rumi, wrote, "The heart is a thousand-stringed lute, waiting for the hand that knows how to play." In that line, the idea of a daily habit is clear. The heart can be tuned by small, regular actions. When a person pauses to breathe, the strings settle and the music of the day becomes softer. This simple image can guide anyone who wishes to bring Sufi ideas into the flow of work, school, or home life. Modern teachers of Sufism have taken that image and turned it into practical advice. Kabir Helminski, a contemporary guide, often suggests a 3-minute breathing pause before any important task. He calls the pause a spiritual breath. But the practice is simply a moment to notice the rise and fall of the chest. Another teacher, Sheikh Nadsim al-Kubrusi, recommends keeping a gratitude journal that lists 3 small things each night. The act of writing creates a habit, and the habit creates a feeling of thankfulness that spreads through the day. These habits are easy to try. Imagine a person about to make a phone call at work. Instead of dialing straight away, the person takes a slow breath, counts to 4, holds for 2, then exhales for 4. The call starts with a calm voice, and the listener feels the calm too. In another scene, a colleague offers a piece of fruit to a coworker who looks tired. The small act of sharing a snack becomes a reminder that kindness can be a daily prayer. The daily routine of a 15th century Sufi master named Ibn Arabi offers a vivid picture of how simple habits can shape a whole life. Ibn Arabi rose before sunrise, washed his face, and spent 10 minutes in silent breathing while the sky turned pink. He then wrote a short note of gratitude for the night's rest, followed by a brief walk through his garden, where he tended a single rose bush. After the walk, he served tea to his students, listening to their concerns with full attention. The whole day was built on short, repeated actions that kept his mind centered and his heart open. A different historical anecdote shows how a whole village can use shared intention and simple work to solve a problem. In the early 1600s, a small village in Anatolia faced a severe water shortage. The villagers gathered at the old shrine, prayed together for rain, and then organized a group to dig a new well. They took turns, each working for an hour, then resting while chanting a short prayer. Within weeks the well filled and the water flowed. The story is told not as a miracle alone, but as a reminder that prayer, when paired with honest labor, can turn a crisis into a community triumph. These two stories illustrate a core Sufi teaching. The sacred is found in ordinary tasks, whether it is a master tending a rose or a village digging a well. The act becomes a form of worship when it is done with awareness and love. That idea can be applied to modern life in many ways. A student can pause before opening a textbook, breathe, and set an intention to learn with an open heart. A driver can notice the feeling of the steering wheel, feeling each turn as a chance to stay present. Each tiny pause becomes a thread that weaves a larger pattern of calm. Some people argue that such habits are too spiritual for a busy schedule. They say that a day filled with meetings, deadlines, and chores leaves no room for a spiritual breath. The counterpoint is that the habits do not require extra time. They fit inside existing moments. A 3-minute pause before a call does not add to the schedule, it reshapes a moment that already exists. Studies in psychology show that brief mindfulness breaks can lower stress hormones and improve focus. A simple breathing exercise, done for even 30 seconds, can reduce cortisol, the body's stress chemical, by a measurable amount. The benefit is not a mystical claim, but a practical boost to health and productivity. Another common objection is that Sufi practices lack scientific proof, and that without data they are just feel-good rituals. While the deep language of love and union may not be measured by a lab, the specific actions, breathing, gratitude, kindness, have been studied. Research on gratitude journals finds that people who write 3 things they are thankful for each night sleep better and report higher life satisfaction. Experiments on acts of kindness show that giving a small gift triggers release of oxytocin, a hormone linked to bonding and reduced anxiety. When a person sees that a simple habit aligns with research, the practice feels less like a mystery and more like a useful tool. The modern interpretation of Sufi ideas often focuses on the term presence. Presence means being fully aware of what is happening now, without being lost in worries about the past or future. In plain language, it is the same as paying attention. When a person listens to a friend without planning a reply, that moment becomes a small act of presence. When a person washes dishes and feels the warm water on the hands, that moment can become a quiet prayer. The Sufi phrase, dhikr, which means remembrance, is often translated as remembrance of the divine. But in daily life, it can simply mean remembering to be kind, to breathe, to smile. Analogy helps to see how these habits work. Think of a garden that is tended a little each day. If a gardener pulls a few weeds each morning, waters the plants, and watches the sun rise, the garden thrives without a huge effort. If the gardener waits a whole season to do anything, the garden may become overrun. Likewise, a person who adds a small habit each day, like a breath before a call, a note of thanks, a kind word, creates a mental garden that stays healthy. The garden does not need a single grand act. It needs regular care. The practice of mindful breathing can be linked to a simple image of a balloon. When the balloon is full, it rises gently. When the breath is shallow, the balloon stays low. By taking a slow, deep breath, a person fills the internal balloon, allowing the mind to rise above the noise of the day. The image is easy for anyone to picture, and it does not require any special equipment. Another everyday example comes from a teacher who uses the pause and share method in a classroom. Before the bell rings, the teacher asks the students to close their eyes, breathe 3 times, and think of one thing they can do for a classmate. The students then share a quick note or a smile. The routine takes less than 5 minutes, but it sets a tone of kindness that lasts through the lesson. The method mirrors the Sufi practice of suhbat, meaning companionship, where seekers sit together in silence and share simple thoughts. The story of the village that dug a well also offers a lesson for modern teens. In a corporate setting, a group may face a big deadline that feels impossible. By gathering for a short moment of shared intention, perhaps a quick circle where each person states a hope for the project, and then dividing the work into short, timed blocks, the team can move forward with both heart and hand. The shared intention acts like the prayer, and the work acts like the digging. The result is a well of progress that can sustain the whole group. Even small acts of kindness can be seen as a form of sama, which in Sufi tradition means listening to the music of the heart. When a person offers a snack to a colleague, the act creates a tiny echo of love that can spread. The colleague may feel seen, may smile, and may pass on the kindness to another. The ripple effect is similar to a stone dropped in water, creating circles that reach far beyond the initial splash. Historical records show that Sufi masters often use simple daily rituals to teach deeper truths. The Persian mystic Attar wrote about a traveler who stopped at each milepost to say a short prayer and to stretch his legs. The traveler's journey became a lesson in patience and gratitude. The story is not about a miracle, but about the power of breaking a long road into small, mindful steps. In modern life, a long commute can be broken into short moments of gratitude for the music on the radio, the view outside the window, or the chance to breathe deeply. A quote from the 13th century poet Ibn Al-Qayyim captures the spirit of daily practice. Do not wait for the perfect moment, make each moment perfect. The line reminds the listener that the search for a special time to be spiritual often delays action. Instead, the call is to turn ordinary moments into opportunities for growth. This message ties directly to the invitation to try a simple habit today. The modern teacher Sheikh Fadl al-Aheri often says, "A single breath can be a prayer if it is held with intention." He suggests that a person can count each breath as a small offering, turning a routine action into a reminder of love. The suggestion is easy to follow. While waiting for a bus, count each inhale and exhale and feel each count as a gentle nod to the world. The practice does not require a shrine or a special garment. It only needs a moment of awareness. Research on brief mindfulness practices supports the claim that such habits improve daily life. A study at a university found that participants who took 5 minutes of focused breathing each morning reported lower anxiety scores after 2 weeks. Another study on gratitude found that people who kept a nightly gratitude list slept an average of 15 minutes longer. These findings show that the small steps taught by Sufi masters can have measurable effects, even if the deeper language of love remains beyond the scope of a lab. Critics may also say that the language of union with the divine feels too abstract for a busy mind. The response is that the language can be translated into plain terms. Union can be understood as feeling connected to others, to nature, or to one's own values. When a person feels that connection, the stress of a hectic schedule often eases. The feeling of connection can be cultivated by a short act of listening, by a brief pause, or by a moment of gratitude. In that way, the lofty idea becomes a practical tool. One modern example comes from a community center in Chicago that runs a mindful coffee break each afternoon. Participants sit together, sip coffee, and breathe together for 2 minutes before sharing a kind word with the person next to them. The center reports that participants feel more focused after the break and that conflicts among staff have decreased. The program shows how a Sufi-inspired habit can be woven into a modern workplace. Another example is a young mother who uses a gratitude journal with her children. Each night, the family writes 3 things they enjoyed that day. The practice has turned bedtime into a calm ritual, and the children report feeling happier at school. The mother says the habit helps her stay present with her kids, even when the day is full of